Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada, and this is the first of a series of videos I intend to create and release on this YouTube channel that address my new book coming out in August of 2026, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. This will be published by Oxford University Press, and I'm thrilled to say that it will be freely available to download as an open access book. In this, the first installment video, I'm just going to cover the table of contents to give you a bird's eye perspective of some of the issues that I've spent more than 20 years researching and 10 years writing for this particular book. At the moment of filming this video in late April 2026, I'm going through the final proofs of the editing process. And as all authors will know, this can be a rather tedious and time-consuming task. And to make it a little bit more palatable, I thought, why don't I create some of these videos now while the ideas are all fresh in my mind as I'm spending a lot of time in the trench of going through all the chapters of the book. So if we reveal the cover and open it up, we find inside that there are a dozen chapters and a rather substantive introduction, which, as we'll see in subsequent videos, is really critical to the argumentation that I want to deploy in the book. Looking a little closer, we see that first, there's the lengthy introduction called The Tale of the Journey Through the Ocean of Longevity, and I will release a series of videos that goes through that tale, explains what the purpose and function of that tale is. But what you can expect to see are things like this, which are related to the front cover image of the book. Now, I will have a lot to say about the themes that you see represented in the front cover of this book, but let me just highlight a few of them right now. The very first thing to note is that the steamship is actually the steamship of modern public health, right? Initially, humanity made very little progress on the ocean of longevity. We had very high rates of early and midlife mortality for over 99% of our species' evolutionary history. And it's only been in the last 200 or so years that humanity has made serious progress in abating these high rates of infectious disease and poverty mortality. The waves that we see here are represent various diseases responsible for human mortality, and the biggest waves that humanity faced in the early stages of progress up through the ocean were the infectious diseases responsible for early life mortality, such as cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, a long list of infectious diseases. But as those larger waves of infectious disease abated and humanity made further progress, a new series of waves came from the ocean, and these are the waves represented by the chronic conditions of later life, such as cancer, heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's. And the iceberg in the background represents the biological limit to human longevity imposed by biological aging itself. And then finally, the shadowy figure in the back is the creature from Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. This book is actually about the role of imagination in medical science, and I'll have a lot to say about the imagery that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein creates in terms of what we think about experimental science and some of the unhelpful frames commonly deployed when the issue of longevity science is raised. Now, this book has been many years in the making. It builds on 20 years of research, but I spent the last decade building a series of journal articles as the foundation for the main argumentation. And I'll just highlight three here that were really critical to advancing the broad argumentation I deploy in the book. Now, initially, it wasn't clear to me that I was going to be able to bring all this together as a book. I was just writing individual articles articles and hoping that it would all come together sometime into the future. So one of the central articles is Gerald Science and Public Health's Plastic Ecology of Ideas that I published in the Journals of Gerontology in 2023. So this canvasses the intellectual presuppositions of early public health pioneers who were really trying to problem solve a world where most death occurred in early life from infectious disease and poverty. But we have to remain plastic in the sense that the problems facing today's aging populations are not the same as those problems that humanity faced 100 or 200 years ago. And so the idea of the ecology of ideas is that the ideas we have about public health in terms of its aspirations and the tools to allow us to get there have to evolve to be specific to the problems that we face in the 21st century. Another article that the book builds on, I published in Aging and Disease, called Post-Protean Public Health and the Gerald Science Hypothesis. So the original, one of the early public health pioneers, Charles Winslow, who coined public health as the art and science of disease prevention and extending life, described public health as being protean, meaning it quickly changes as the most prevalent diseases abate and new diseases come to the fore. It has to rapidly shift its approach to targeting those diseases. And the idea of post-protean public health is to transcend some of those intellectual suppositions, that actually the aspirations of medical science should not only concern, the prevention and mitigation of specific diseases, but more broadly, just improving health, and targeting biological aging is thus critical to the health of today's aging populations. Finally, a commentary I published in Age and Aging titled Wisdom Inquiry Science is Essential for Healthy Longevity. So just these three articles give you a sense, slowly I was progressing towards unifying them. I'll say a lot more about wisdom inquiry science. This was a critical component that allowed me to bring all of the ideas for the book together in a unified way by utilizing some of the insights from philosophy of science. Right, the second chapter, the first substantive chapter of the book is philosophy and the framing of translational science. I spent a long time, paradoxically, I spent a long time writing a book, and I didn't know exactly who the audience was going to be for the book. I knew I wanted to write this book. Most of the early articles, as you just saw, are in science journals, especially those that specialize in the biology of aging. But I'm a philosopher by training, and I've been working in a political science department for over 26 years, and I wanted to bridge the gap between social science and the humanities and the natural sciences. But this issue became clear to me when I came across an excellent book by one of my favorite living philosophers, Philip Kitcher, in his book, What's the Use of Philosophy? In particular, Kitcher emphasizes that when philosophers are addressing issues of science, they should have three audiences in mind: philosophers, scientists, and then the general educated public who want to understand what the significance of translational science is. And so I was really inspired by Kitcher's characterization and that of John Dewey, that philosophy really is a theory of education. And this book is to try to educate the general reader about the ethical and societal predicaments that face the field of translational gerontology that aspires to develop novel innovations to increase the human health span. The second chapter is putting aging on the radar. Within the field of bioethics and political philosophy and political theory, population aging is pretty much non-existent. I want to remedy this by bringing attention to the plurality of fascinating issues that are raised by population aging. So a lot of this chapter canvasses empirical insights concerning how many people are going to be surviving past age 60 by the middle and end of this century, and how we ought to frame the challenges of population aging. This chapter draws on an article that I had published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. Here you can see in the December 2024 issue, the front cover utilizes an image I deployed in the commentary that looked at the first editorial ever published in that journal, which was actually from a fellow Canadian, Willard Thompson, and he argued that we had to target aging itself as a way to improve the quality of life for persons reaching the upper bounds of human longevity. And so here is the video abstract of that earlier article, which is foundational to the argumentation deployed in the book.
The very first sentence published in JAGS was from Willard Thompson's 1953 editorial. Everyone hopes to live to a ripe old age in a state of good health. To make the aspiration of healthy aging a reality, Thompson maintained that two major problems had to be addressed. The first was the care of the aging population. The second problem required a concentrated attack on the causes of aging. From its inception, JAGS encouraged the prioritization of translational gerontology, the development of interventions that target the mechanisms of biological aging in the hopes of extending healthy lifespan. This is now commonly referred to as the geroscience hypothesis. Public communication about science is effective science communication when it gets the attention of the audience and helps them comprehend enough of the science to motivate them to support taking appropriate action. Attending to the communicative challenges facing translational gerontology is particularly important for geriatricians, as they are charged with the care of older populations, but also advocate for scientific innovations that increase health span. In communication science, a frame is a communication that organizes everyday reality, and the dominant frames employed by the media typically involve stories relating to human deaths and suffering. Negativity drives online news consumption. However, no one officially dies from aging, which threatens to marginalize the importance of translational gerontology. Some researchers have proposed that aging itself should be classified as a disease to be added to the ongoing war against disease frame of public health. But this frame risks pathologizing chronological aging and can perpetuate ageism. A more effective communicative frame is the following twofold strategy. Number 1, highlighting the diminishing health dividends of the war against disease paradigm for aging populations, and number 2, highlighting the significant advances made over a century of research on the biology of aging and the potential that gerotherapeutics have to help ameliorate the health vulnerabilities of an aging, warming, and unequal world.
Chapter 3 has to be the most enjoyable and creative chapter that I wrote in the book, The Frankensteinification of Translational Gerontology. I'll post a series of videos on this as well. In February or March of 2025, I was rereading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I found a number of ways of connecting the way that she deploys our imagination with respect to experimental science and a lot of the concerns that people raise about trying to intentionally modulate human aging by developing drugs that will modulate the rate of aging. So I will say a lot more about Frankenstein and translational gerontology. Imagination and Idealism After the COVID-19 Pandemic. This builds on an article I had published in Royal Society's Open Science. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I think public health really dropped the ball in some serious ways. And really, we were ill prepared for it because we had not aggressively targeted biological aging in the past. And so with a large gap between lifespan and health span, unfortunately, older persons were very vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2. So that chapter builds on that article. Moving on to the other chapters of the book, public health must transcend folk biology. So this builds on a piece that I published in Public Health Ethics, and it really involved doing a lot of doing a deep dive into the intellectual history of public health and medicine. As I mentioned earlier, Charles Winslow's War Against Disease was really conceptualized at a time when the greatest health threats to human populations came in the form of infectious disease mortality early in life. But those same intellectual presuppositions can be a constraint when our goal is to try to improve health in the adult lifespan, and that is why and so in that chapter, I note that actually there's remnants of folk biology in the way that public health was initially conceptualized by early 20th century public health pioneers. Chapter 6 focuses on what usually is the common objection or reservation that I face in my own research and teaching on this field, is that people's imagination automatically goes to an aging innovation exacerbating inequality in the world rather than actually helping to redress it. I think there's some valid concerns with this point, but I think it overlooks the powerful potential that gerotherapeutics have to actually benefit those who suffer the accelerated rate of aging from exposure to the environmental stressors that accelerate biological aging. So gerotherapeutics can actually be a very effective tool in remedying the shortcomings of our unjust social structures, and so I'll be unpacking that chapter in a future video. Chapter 7 is on women's health and longevity, and I think this is a really critical point of the book and for the field of geroscience, and I expect to be doing a lot of my future research on this topic. This article initially was published in Longevity Science in Women's Health and Well-Being. Women throughout the world live longer than men, but they survive with poorer health. The health span lifespan gap is about 2.4 years longer for women than it is for men. And so a really important part of geroscience advocacy is to make concrete the different benefits that could be realized for women's health and well-being across the lifespan. And that chapter focuses on a variety of different benefits for women. Chapter 8 is on the war on cancer. I published 2 articles to mark the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's war against cancer in 1971. It's a great example of the politicalization of science. Nixon believed that cancer could be eradicated. And at the time in 1971, cancer was the second leading cause of death in the United States. And now, more than half a century later, and billions being invested every year in the war against cancer, sadly, cancer remains the second leading cause of death, although real success has been made in pushing the average age of cancer mortality into later ages. But this faces a predicament that as you keep pushing cancer mortality further and further into older ages, you're going to be opening up the door to more debilitating conditions becoming more prevalent, such as Alzheimer's disease. So I published 2 pieces to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the war on cancer, a piece in biogerontology and one in geroscience. And in this chapter, I do a deep dive into the intellectual history behind the aspiration to eradicate cancer. I came across a great book, it's more than a century old, called The Conquest of Cancer by Wright. And I use that as another example of how our imagination usually is invoked for eradicating diseases, but we don't have clear examples of how to facilitate helpful imagination in thinking about the pursuit of healthy longevity and the geroscience hypothesis. Chapters 8 and 9 represent new research for me. I didn't build those chapters off of any previously published articles, and they really represent substantive constraints on the field of longevity science that while people care about surviving a long time and they care about their health, they also care about a lot of other things, namely having purpose and meaning in their life. And this is really important for the broader perspective on what constitutes wisdom inquiry science, of which longevity science is only a subset of topics. So this means that the types of interventions that are going to be feasible and desirable for populations to pursue to increase healthy longevity have to be scrutinized, and we need to spend a lot of attention on the feasibility component and recognizing that people have constraints on what they pursue. Chapters 11 and 12 address what I've faced in my own teaching and research for the last decade as one of the main criticisms or opposition that people have to longevity science is the perception that extending the duration of healthy life is going to be catastrophic for planetary health. And so I published two articles that are the basis of Chapter 11, Aging Cell, which really seeks to quash this narrative of conflict between geroscience and climate science, and then a piece in Biology Letters where I link the idea of interdisciplinary research on the climate and aging to wisdom inquiry science. And I'm going to show you the video abstract for Aging Cell, which tries to transcend the narratives of conflict between these two areas of science.
The future of humanity will be both warmer and older than it is today. Using prediction models, scientists at NASA have estimated that, depending on the steps taken for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the global temperature may rise by 2.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Simultaneously, it is anticipated that 3.1 billion people will be over the age of 60 worldwide, including nearly 20% of the population in Africa, the world's youngest continent. Is it socially responsible in a warming planet of a population exceeding 8 billion people for science to aspire to develop gerotherapeutic drugs that aim to reduce the burden of aging-related diseases that may also increase lifespan? This question is, for the field of geroscience, the elephant in the room. It is a question the field must tackle head-on to avoid risking the marginalization of the science of healthy aging. While communicating what constitutes empirically valid and morally defensible ways of navigating the public health predicaments of climate change and healthy aging, science communication must be sensitive to both the interdependence of the environment and the mechanisms of aging, as well as the common misperceptions about the potential conflict between the goals of climate science and geroscience. Geroscience advocacy can transcend narratives of intergenerational conflict by highlighting the shared aspirations of climate science and geroscience, such as the goals of promoting health across the lifespan, redressing health disparities, and improving the economic prospects of current and future generations.
This takes me to the final chapter, the geroscience perspective on One Health. This chapter appeared as a journal article in a special issue of Bioscience on One Health. And so in this final concluding chapter, I emphasize the importance of highlighting the interdependency between human health, animal health, and planetary health. These three things are all linked, and it's really important for the field of geroscience to emphasize how keeping people healthy throughout the adult lifespan is going to be beneficial for planetary health. And again, this can help redress the common perception that there must be some conflict between the aspiration to increase healthy lifespan and promoting planetary health. So that wraps up this first video on aging and the ethics of longevity science. It was a bird's eye view perspective, looking at the table of contents and giving you a sense of the research I've been building on for the last decade to make this book a reality. I'm really looking forward to its publication in a few months' time, and I'm looking forward to the broader societal conversation about why translational gerontology is so critical to the health of today's aging populations.